Well, I got my Dunkin' and I'm 20 now. You're 20?
With
You're
you.
20?
Yeah.
Like literally. Welcome to the new year. Hi everyone. It is 2026. My name is Amira Redwing and I love to talk. I like to talk to process my own feelings, my own emotions, my understanding of the world, and hopefully this space allows you to join me in conversation to just think, feel, and be really truly welcome. There's no ice, but we're gonna pretend there's ice. Today's episode I want to call Beyond the Binary, which is essentially all about understanding our thinking. Because you don't understand or realize how much your mode of thinking impacts your life until you reflect on it. For the most part, we genuinely understand that, like, if you have pessimistic thoughts, then you will internalize those feelings and they will show up in the outcomes of your life. You know, people talk about manifestation being a real thing, and positive affirmations are so important, like checking up on one another. That's why people read the Bible, turn to religion, and stuff like that, so that they can exist comfortably in positive affirmation. But one thing I've noticed is that a lot of people have forgotten what we've learned thus far. Remember how, or I don't know, at my high school, when I was in about 8th grade, because my high school started at 7th grade, in 8th grade, I had a teacher. His name was Mr. Walker. Shout out Mr. Walker. I don't know if he'll ever see this, but he was a teacher, a math teacher for pre-algebra, I believe. Maybe it was algebra 1, but that was probably the last time I really enjoyed math. But I remember why I enjoyed that math class, and it was because he was a professor who heavily advocated for students adopting a growth mindset. And you know, some math teachers throughout my high school and even collegiate career will say, like, you have to try, like, you have to be willing to accept failure and come back to the table prepared to start anew. But he didn't just do that, he did something more. He actually explained and lived a growth mindset with his students. He was such a positive person. Like that man was just really truly a great teacher and like a genuine person. And I digress. But in math or in educational spheres, you hear this concept of having a growth mindset when it comes to academia and tackling new concepts and new ideas. And I think that we often forget that this translates to our everyday, to our current lives. What do I mean? Well, you have to be willing to accept that in some way, shape, or form, you are able to fail, and or that you might be inadequate. And I don't mean inadequate in a negative sense. And I think that's what a growth mindset employs you to think about: inadequacy and what it means to be lacking. I think to lack simply means that there's a possibility for more. And this is really important because the way you approach yourself in terms of viewing your inadequacies and your capacity for growth impacts how you interact with other people, truly. What I mean by this is I've always been someone, I think, who has deep admiration for that which I do not yet have, for other people's value. And one of my professors last year in my constitutional law class talked about the importance of having value as a person. And I think there's something to be said about the fact that capitalist society employs us to have value instead of just viewing others as valuable because of our shared humanity. But the fact that we live in a society where you have to have value in order to receive some type of validation or return or investment from other people, whether that be emotionally, financially, professionally, like, etc. I think that is why we're so fearful of being inadequate. Because if we're inadequate in some way, shape, or form, then we lack value. And if we lack value, then how can we survive? I guess the question then becomes, what can we do to have a growth mindset, especially within a society that doesn't necessarily often reward accepting where you're inadequate, or at least verbalizing that? I think it all comes down to critical versus concrete thinking. I think that people who tend to be concrete thinkers are also people who are lacking in the growth mindset department. And I think that people who are critical thinkers are willing to exist with a certain level of humility, void of unhealthy ego, and actually adopt a frame of mind that allows them to be curious, be open, be aware, be honest, and be ready for something bigger than what they currently are. Concrete thinking, I believe, often shows up because of binary thinking. And we live in a society that encourages, rewards, and creates these linear forms, these binary forms, these black and white forms of thinking. And if things aren't black and white, then they must be gray or must not be gray. But they can't ever be an entire rainbow. I think people who understand binary thinking, for example, like we talk about binaries, we talk about queer folk, like they understand what I mean when I say binary thinking. Like they live that reality, it's in their identity. I think Black people too, when Du Bois talks about double consciousness, what that means, he's really drawing question to this way in which we exist in a world that is so two-dimensional. Maybe three-dimensional, but there's other dimensions to life. And I think people often lack nuance and believe that they're being nuanced because they see the gray area. But seeing the gray area, I think, doesn't make you more nuanced. I think what makes you more nuanced is asking why we can't see an entire rainbow. Why we can't see beyond black or white. What else exists outside this box that we've created? And this theme of binary thinking shows up so often. It's scary, honestly. I'll give an example. When people are talking about, because mind you, it's 3-4 days, 5 days now, but this happened day 3 into the new year, my birthday. We're 3 days into the new year. I swear everything happens on January, that first week of January with this guy. But we're into the new year and we're already seeing how binary thinking impacts people's ability to find containment. Let me get there first. Donald Trump strikes Venezuela. And I think Venezuela is a good example because honestly, any imperial project is a great example of how deeply ingrained we are taught to have binary thinking. Because I think most people are coming to this conclusion, right, that two things can exist at once. That, for example, Venezuelans can celebrate this person being gone from office, but also can be weary about Donald Trump. But nobody's asking the question that doesn't exist within this scale of celebrating this person being gone and acknowledging a new person's authoritative presence. The question no one's asking is, how did this authoritarianism even come to exist? In what ways could a leader have failed? Is it individual choice? Or were there structural implications setting them up for failure before they even started? Was it cognitive dissonance that made them an authoritative person? Or did the system give way to authoritarianism? I think we get so caught up in placing blame on an individual because to sit with the possibility that there's inadequacy in ourselves, in our way of thought, or in a system is to admit vulnerability, that the system itself is vulnerable, that we are vulnerable. And I really, really think that what people should be saying is it's okay to feel relief that this authoritative figure is gone. But I think instead of looking at this individual, and this is not absolving them of responsibility, but instead of looking at this individual as the sole perpetrator of violence, why don't we ask how they even were able to do it? What gave way? Who gave way? What systems were in place? When we don't ask these questions about systems, when we don't confront this binary thinking that we have, we become apathetic. We blame individuals, each other, pointing fingers instead of looking beyond this box that we're in. They don't want us to have a semblance of agency or be able to find containment. There are people who see the box, but still are vulnerable, are feeling vulnerable, are existing emotionally. And it's because to challenge those thoughts that are creating cognitive dissonance a lot of times is to sit with this uncomfortable feeling. And this is why I give people a lot of grace, because I understand that it's uncomfortable. And we already live in an uncomfortable society. So who wants to be duly burdened, right? But that uncomfortableness, it has to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, then we're giving way to conformity. We're giving way to systems that aren't going to change. Think of it like the movie Maze Runner. The whole time, the whole movie, they're mapping out the maze. They're trying to find a way out. But the maze is changing and different, and they're literally in a box, and they don't know it. They're in an artificially created maze, and they think that the way out is possible by figuring out the maze. It takes till the end of the movie for them to think about that what if this maze isn't all there is? What if this box is manufactured? What if there's something beyond it? People don't often go there, as you saw within the movie, because it's uncomfortable. That's why only a couple people were the maze runners, while the rest of them stayed comfortably in their box. Dystopian movies have a way of highlighting the fact that we should be thinking in terms of systems, what structurally is impacting us, rather than who, when, and why do I feel this way. And it's not that you can't have feelings, and it's not that your feelings aren't valid, but I think you feel more affirmed by your own personal anger if you can actually direct that anger towards the true perpetrator. And they don't want you to do that. They don't want you to do that. They don't want you to think like that. They don't want you to accept that that is a possibility, because then you become conscious. People, for example, who talk to me sometimes often think that I like to argue. That, I'm here to argue. And that's sort of when I take a step back, because I think that showcases more of their mode of thought about conversation than my actual intentions or motives. And I'm not saying that certain things or certain tones can't promote or showcase a certain impact. They can't demonstrate a certain impact. But I think that a lot of times I'm actually just trying to find your line of reasoning. I'm trying to understand you. I'm seeking clarity. I'm trying to find not absoluteness, but a resolution. I'm trying to get you to ask the why. I'm trying to figure out the why that I'm asking. I'm trying to understand. And I think people who think that people are in conversation who are arguing, I think the reason that they don't think that, oh, like maybe this person is really just coming to understand is because to ask questions is to admit that you don't know the answer or that it's not fully fleshed out. And people are scared to ask those questions. Not only because asking those questions reveals that you are seeking an answer, but because sometimes the answer isn't so clear. I think that you can sit with wonder, but we don't often do that because it takes humility, it takes a growth mindset, it takes understanding that you might be inadequate. Not that there's anything wrong with being inadequate. There's not. I'm not saying that people should start doing the impossible. But I think that my dad used to do something, my parents used to do a lot of things in my youth that I reflect on. But one thing I remember is we used to be in the car or we would be out and we would see a plane in the sky. And my dad and me and my brother, sometimes my mom, would play this game where anytime we saw a plane in the sky, we would say, I have vision. And I never understood then what the point of the game was. I really just thought it was like, I wear contacts, like I wear glasses, so I thought it was like a funny joke, like, my brother doesn't, they have good eyesight, so I always thought it was like a who sees the plane first, like who's being aware, like who is taking note of things, who can see that far, like superficial things. But as I've gotten older, I realized that wasn't a game. It was an affirmation. My dad was teaching that you can see well beyond what you can touch. You can know way beyond what distance makes hard to perceive. You have vision because you have eyes. And distance shouldn't be a defining factor in your ability to be affirmed by what you know. There's something really powerful in that. It was an affirmation. It wasn't about manifesting, but it was about knowing. And Socrates talks about knowing and knowledge and da 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 da. This is very philosophical, but no, truly knowledge and having a love for knowledge, it makes you, I want to say, a more empathetic person, a more well-rounded person, a more fluid person, a more whole person, a person in their self-concept without a need for these superficial systems we've created around hierarchy and subscribing to the notion that we must do something or be some type of thing in order to have value. I don't believe that's true. I think you as a person have value because you're a human being and you're on this earth, and your perspective matters. For sure, everyone's perspective matters. I don't want to say but I will say and. Everyone's perspective matters, and the most compelling perspectives are always the ones that look outside this box that we've been placed in and ask why. That's what Beyond the Binary is about. Asking why. Yearning for knowledge. And accepting a level of humility that requires you to ask the questions and show up to a table that you might not be feeling the most welcomed at. You have to have vision. But to have vision, you have to be affirmed that what you're seeing isn't crazy. It's not far-fetched to look beyond. It's simply human. That I'm somewhat naive and don't really know everything, but that I trust my intuition and don't view it as delusion. I think that's really what my 20s is all about. Just being, accepting what I see and know, observing patterns and asking why, asking questions, and being unafraid of the fact that I don't know everything and that I'm still making things out. That's really what life is about. Accepting the unknowing while seeking knowledge and being affirmed in your reality. I think not in a naive sense where like you should just exist in your bubble, but and not be challenged and not be introspective. You should do those things, right? But that's what I mean by knowledge. Like someone coming up to me and saying like, well, this is what I think. Well, I'm going to sit with that. I'm going to sit with what you think, and I'm going to sit with how you feel. If someone says to me, oh, you did this and I feel this way, I'm going to sit with that. Even if it wasn't my intention, I'm going to sit with how did that impact come about. Even if it makes me feel guilty, even if it forces me into some level of accountability, sitting with that feeling of guilt reminds you of your humility, of your humanness. We're human. We make mistakes. We don't know everything. Things become patterns when we don't practice observing patterns before they become concrete in our thinking, in our being. Anyway, and that's all for today, because I want to finish my Dunkin'. Love y'all. Come back for episode 4.